Thanks to AHA for inviting me. Thanks for putting together this conference so that we can connect while staying safe. I'm presenting today from the unceded land of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Peoria peoples. Again, my name is Krista Cox, and my pronouns are she, hers. I also would like to take a moment to thank all of the theorists, activists, and educators whose work has built the foundation for the things that I'm going to talk about today. And I'd like to specifically acknowledge all of the labor of women of color on projects like these, which is often exploited and rendered invisible. I do want to mention also, because I've been watching today and I've noticed it mentioned a couple times in the chat, for my visually impaired attendees, I am using a PowerPoint presentation, but it does not contain any information that I will not be talking about out loud, so you're not missing anything there. For anyone who's hearing impaired, I do apologize for the lack of captioning at this time. You can request a transcript of the full talk by reaching out to Nicole, and I understand that the archived video will be captioned. Now, I am going to start with a story that I am not very proud of. Many years ago, I dipped my toes into the online dating pool after my divorce. It is a very tepid and algae-covered pool in many ways. And so, as a result, I got lots of dehumanizing and offensive and sometimes incoherent messages. To blow off steam, I would sometimes post them on my social media so that my friends and I could have a laugh or commiserate, offer mutual support. One time I posted this particularly incoherent message, and I said something along the lines of, wow, this guy's not even trying to impress me. And the comments that my friends made were along the lines of what you'd expect. Haha, what? Or wow, that's some serious word salad. Until my friend Amy commented. Amy said, actually, my husband is deaf, and his first language was American Sign Language. The syntax of this message looks a lot like someone who learned ASL first and written English second. It is offensive and ableist that you're making fun of him. My immediate response was anger. I frantically typed a private message to another friend who had been on the thread and said, oh, did you see what Amy said to me? As if I'm an ableist. Am I not even allowed to vent my frustrations on my own private Facebook account? My friend, who is very calm and measured, said, it sounds like you feel really attacked. And I did, because how dare she? I'm an activist. And even though I'm not primarily a disability activist, I do think about things like accessibility in my work, and I do care about issues affecting disabled people. I don't say the R word anymore, or even lame as a pejorative, which is a lot more than most people. And I got more and more worked up and started drafting an angry response to Amy's comment. And then my friend did something really surprising and a little bit brave and deeply transformative. She asked, what would it mean about you if she were right? And the answer to that question is important, but not as important as the space that asking it created, space between my emotional reaction and the action that I took in response. That space facilitated and encouraged reflection. In other words, I got defensive. The word that my friend used, attacked, is important to explain why I responded the way that I did. What happens when we feel attacked? If we're face to face with the lion, I love this image, by the way, it triggers our stress response. Fight or flight. We all know about that, right? The amygdala interprets the image of the lion as a threat, which sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, which pumps adrenaline through your body. All of this happens before your conscious mind even realizes that there's a lion in front of you. The problem is that to the amygdala, uncomfortable emotions often look exactly like hungry lions. So in this case, Amy was the lion, and I immediately and reflexively adopted a posture intended to protect what she seemed to be threatening. My self-esteem, my character, my beliefs about the kind of person that I am, not to mention my social standing and the high opinion of my friends and my activist cred. In that moment, it felt like she was threatening my entire understanding of myself as a person, my goodness. And I desperately and instinctively needed to defend that understanding. Again, I got defensive. So what does this have to do with you? A couple of weeks ago, I attended the virtual Secular Student Alliance conference, and I saw a speech there by Callie Wright on having difficult conversations. Highly recommend that you look it up. So Callie was talking about how to persuade people to see your side of controversial social issues, like, for example, how to talk to your racist uncle over Thanksgiving dinner. His views, Callie said, did not form in a vacuum, and they're part of a complex tapestry of beliefs that he has, both conscious and unconscious, about the world and his place in it. Understanding those beliefs, and especially where they come from, Callie continued, is key to changing minds. So this talk is effectively the counterpart to Callie's. How do you have difficult conversations when you're the racist uncle? I will back up a minute in case I made you defensive there, and we'll talk about why learning to recognize and counteract defensiveness is a valuable and important skill, even if you're not the racist uncle, and how it can help uphold our humanist values. Number one, reason. So as we all know, humanists, atheists, skeptics, we're guided by reason. We believe that knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. Unfortunately, sometimes this intense focus on rationality can lead to a kind of de facto disregard for emotion. This seems to be especially true of uncomfortable or inconvenient emotions, the kind that we'd rather not deal with. So reason and rationality are absolutely vital to human progress. Anjan talked about that just a moment ago. But I think that we tend to underestimate the ways that emotion can impact our ability to reason. Psychological research shows that defensiveness has a negative impact on our ability to objectively consider information and ideas, especially if that information represents a threat to one's understanding of the world or the self. In other words, defensiveness prevents objectivity and rationality. Humanists who value rationality must learn to identify and address their own defensiveness. As Anjan said, we need reliable information. Number two, truth. The feminist social theorist, Dr. Kimberly B. George, studies and writes about topics like implicit bias and interrogating our position in systems of power and oppression. She says quite beautifully, quote, "The unconscious itself is akin to a historical archive, but it is a living, here and now, embodied archive with relational and structural implications." So put simply, our psyches are constructed in ways that aren't often fully apparent to us, no matter how intelligent or informed we may be. Our subconscious is just chock full of ideas about the world that we started internalizing from the moment of our birth. If defensiveness causes us to automatically defend our views instead of interrogating them, we continue to walk along with an incomplete, unconsidered version of the truth. As Jay Hooper said during his talk earlier, this is the work of, quote, decolonizing the mind. And we may not even be living our own truths. Dr. George also says that knowing ideas about gender or racial equality does not necessarily mean we live those ideas, as there's a difference between cognitive knowledge and how we integrate those ideas into how we live in relationship with one another, or self-reflect on our own privilege and power. I believed that I was not ableist, and yet there I was, making fun of somebody who may have had a disability. Diffusing my defensiveness allowed me to see my own failure to integrate my ideas about disability into the way that I lived, and that helped me bridge the gap between my idealized self and my actual self, which leads to growth. From the Humanist Manifesto, we aim for our fullest possible development. So in order for this to be true of humanity as a species, it must also be true for individual humans. In other words, personal growth is a humanist value. As humanists, we should each aim to reach for our potential. And since defensiveness can prevent us from hearing and internalizing even valid criticisms and from identifying our biases, it prevents us from growing as people. Number 4, relationship. This is the one that'll affect your daily life a lot more than any of the other categories. So sometimes the things that make us feel defensive feel like criticism, but they're actually not. For example, I have a really difficult time accepting help, even if I asked for it. The other day I was working on coding a website, and I didn't know how to do something in CSS. So I asked my husband, and he said, "Did you try X?" And my instant reaction was, "Ah, of course I did. I'm not stupid." He was collecting information, and I was hearing criticism, and I felt defensive. Even sometimes hearing a person's feelings about something that we've done can feel like criticism. For example, "It hurts my feelings when you go to sleep without saying goodnight," can sound like, "Why aren't you caring for me properly?" Defensiveness can prevent us from collecting information that may help us learn about and better care for those around us. Working on our defensive responses makes all of our relationships better, which is directly related to allyship. This is where the title of this presentation, "The Necessary Discomfort of Progress," comes from. I deeply believe that this kind of personal activism is necessary for large-scale societal progress. In the earlier words of Jay Hooper, we need to do the me search to do the we search. I love that. Works out instantly. So I'm an intersectional feminist and an anti-racist activist. I am also a cisgender white woman. Every day I get to walk through the world without thinking about my race or my gender unless I want to. And that's what it means to be privileged. It also means two very important things to my activism. One, I will get it wrong. In fact, the more active I am in my activism, the more I risk getting it wrong. There are lots of different ways to get it wrong. Sometimes I might say an ableist thing without realizing it. Or maybe I'll do something with the best of intentions that I think is helpful to whatever movement I'm working for, but it's actually harmful, and I just don't have the context to know that. Now, when I get it wrong and somebody lets me know, there's two things that I can do. I can throw the discomfort of that moment back on the person who told me, who's likely to be someone from a marginalized group, or I can sit in that discomfort until I'm ready to embrace the opportunity to make my mistake right and become a better ally and a better person. Two, this also means that I am part of a system that needs deconstructing, which means deconstructing its influence over me. We're all born into various structures: family, neighborhood, town, country. And as I mentioned before, we learn all sorts of things from those structures. Some are explicit and some are implicit. For example, in my family structure, I learned that God is real and shame is a virtue. The first one was explicit, so I could pretty easily identify the ways that it was affecting my behavior, right? Mom says God's real, so I go to church and I pray and I persecute gay people. But the shame thing, that was implicit. And it was a lot more difficult to suss out the ways that it was impacting my behavior, even though it absolutely was. I couldn't change that behavior that was certainly impacting other people, including myself, until I identified the subconscious belief that was perpetuating it. Similarly, I was born into a structure that privileges white folks over people of color, cis people over trans people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That system is both made up of and propped up by people enacting those privileges over and over, sometimes knowingly, but much more often without even realizing their complicity. If we aim to make a better, just society, we need to be able to see the ways that we as individuals unknowingly perpetuate the problems in our society. We need to decolonize the mind. And I can tell you, it is inherently, deeply uncomfortable work. But as therapist Karen O'Connell writes, the costs of feeling the full impact of these systems of violence and oppression are high, but the costs of not feeling them are even higher. So how do you know if you're being defensive? According to psychologists David Nussbaum and Carol Dweck of Stanford University, people generally have 3 defensive responses to negative feedback. They reject it as biased or inaccurate. They use symbolic compensation to compensate for their shortcomings, or they compare their performance to others who are worse. You can see each of those in my response to Amy's criticism. Rejection, I couldn't be ableist. Symbolic compensation, I stopped saying lame as a pejorative. And comparison to others, that's more than most do. So all these responses are ways to diffuse the threat. They calm the discomfort, they resolve the cognitive dissonance, and they restore any lost self-esteem. But they do so without doing anything to address the underlying cause of that negative feedback. And they deny me the opportunity to learn from it. Hopefully at this point, we all agree defensiveness is bad and we need to care about it. So what do? I'm not going to lie, this is not an easy skill to master. It's something that I've been working on for a very long time. And like all skills, it takes practice. But I promise, as someone who's done a lot of this work and who's had the joy of being in relationship with people who can handle their defensiveness well, it is incredibly worth it. So I think that reprogramming your defensive responses is done in two main areas: in the moment and before the moment. Even though it's counterintuitive, we're going to start with in the moment training. So here's what to do when your nephew looks over the turkey at you and says, "That's racist." Step one, stop. This is absolutely the most important step and definitely the most difficult. Adrenaline creates so much forward momentum and it takes a lot of zen to interrupt it. So here are some suggestions for helping to create additional space in that split second between the thing that upsets you and your response to it. Care for the body. So defensiveness is a physical response, right? So you can respond to it physically. You can take a few sips of water, have a snack, take some deep breaths, or weirdly, this actually works, squat like a frog. All of these things signal to your body that there's not really danger, and it can help calm your automatic physical response. Use the buddy system. So in that moment, when you want to yell at the person who just accused you of something, reach out to someone else instead. You want to reach out to somebody who's not just going to hop on the anger train with you, but who knows that you're working on defensiveness. Research demonstrates that psychological safety is paramount to developing new emotional skills and incorporating new challenging information. So it should be someone that you trust and feel safe with. Now, maybe you feel safe with the person who called you out, but it's quite likely that they're not in a position right now to provide you the support that you need. So having somebody else at the ready for that role is great. Practice an automatic response. You have to practice this too, because otherwise it won't be automatic. But something like, "Thank you, I need some time to think about this before I respond." That thank you especially generates a bit of goodwill inside of you for the person who called you out, which can help to calm you down. It also will satiate your desire to say something, anything, and it might smooth things over with that person for a minute while you step away to process. My husband and I, when we're feeling defensive, we just say, "I'm feeling defensive," and both of us know that it's time to step away for a minute so we can calm down. If all else fails, embrace the do-over. The first several times that you try to interrupt your defensive response, you might not even realize that you're in a defensive response until your foot's halfway up the other person's butt. In my experience, it is never too late to take a step back in the process, do your introspection, and then return to the conversation. You know, last week I responded defensively and I only just realized it. Can I have a do-over? And over time, as you practice these skills, you'll find that you will interrupt that cycle sooner and sooner. So you've stopped, now what? Step two is question. Now, some of us are more naturally predisposed or perhaps just more practiced at interrogating our emotions. It's also true that a rich emotional life is stigmatized among some groups, perhaps also including skeptics who value a detached rationality above all else. But what this practice actually is an intellectual inquiry into a physical chemical response. To again refer back to Jay Hooper's presentation, to cry is a form of intelligence, a message from the body. When you're sick, you inquire into the state of your body. "Oh, my stomach hurts. Is it appendicitis or gas? What did I eat that might have caused this? Oh yeah, 3 helpings of Aunt Norma's baked beans." The practice of emotional interrogation is no different at all. My chest is tight, my face feels hot. Is this anger? Is it shame? Why did my body respond this way? So some things that you can ask yourself are, what am I feeling? What am I defending against or resisting? What assumptions or beliefs of mine have been challenged? Am I the best person to determine whether this criticism is legitimate? And my friend's favorite, what do I believe it means about me if this criticism is accurate? So what these questions do is they help turn your focus from the other person, "How dare Amy say that?" to you. Why am I responding this way? It helps you calm down, it helps you collect information, and it helps you evaluate the situation more objectively. Now, the fantastic thing about this process is that it's beneficial in and of itself, completely regardless of the quality of the feedback received. After you take a moment and you process, you might come to the conclusion that the criticism was unwarranted or untrue. But the process itself is valuable in that it's skill building and perspective shifting. Finally, the last step is to respond. I'm not going to say too much about that because it's highly dependent on the individual situation that you're in. I will say 2 recommendations. Be respectful to the best of your ability and use I statements, not you statements. So for example, you wouldn't want to say you would want to say, I was defensive, not you made me defensive. So, before the moment. Because we tend to be a giant rush of emotions when in the midst of a conflict, being prepared for them can have a measurable impact on how we ultimately respond. So here's some things you can do starting right now or immediately after the conference to be ready for your next fight or flight moment. Mindfulness meditation. It might seem silly and unrelated, but mindfulness training can actually have a giant impact on creating a little bit of distance between the turbulence of your emotions and your external response to them. It creates just enough space sometimes so that you can bite your tongue before it wags out of control. Cultivate a growth mindset. If you haven't heard of this before, there's 2 mindsets, fixed and growth. Very simply, fixed means that you have a set and unchangeable amount of intelligence, whereas growth mindset believes that you can grow. So research shows that people who have a growth mindset are much more likely to employ productive rather than defensive responses to criticism. Growth mindset is also a humanist mindset. And there's no potential to strive for if you're born as good as you'll ever get. Consider criticism to be a compliment. All right, sounds crazy, hear me out. I know that there's a lot of talk about call-out culture out there, and I know that some people believe that it brings people great glee to call someone a racist. And that's probably true in certain situations, like on Twitter. But if it's somebody that you know, the chances are really good that it took a tremendous amount of bravery for them to confront you. They summoned the courage and took that emotional risk because they believe that you are something better than your called out behavior suggests. They trusted you to hear them, to be contemplative about what they said, and to respond respectfully. They believe that you can grow. And they'd rather have a really difficult conversation with you than just write you off. And that means something. Self-affirmations, like Stuart Smalley, right? So one of the jobs of defensive responses is to restore any lost self-esteem. But psychologists have demonstrated that self-affirmations self-affirmations and defensiveness are interchangeable ways of alleviating threat. The trick is that the affirmations have to be in place before the threat occurs. So part of the key here is what you affirm. You don't want to convince yourself that you're really good at never making mistakes, because then when you make one, you're just going to be more defensive. What you want to do is build your sense that you're capable of growth, that you're able to take constructive criticism, or that you're capable of overcoming your defensive responses to interact more genuinely and compassionately with people. Rethink discomfort. Often we see uncomfortable emotions as evidence that we've been harmed, somebody's done something wrong. But if there's anything that I've learned through lots of years of therapy, it's that progress itself is uncomfortable. Looking at ourselves honestly is uncomfortable, trying to change is uncomfortable. Start to see discomfort as an opportunity to learn about yourself. Approach it with gentleness and curiosity, and you'll less often go automatically into defense mode. Foster humility. Humility gets a bad rep, and it does have some religious undertones. It's also got lots of definitions, but it can be as simple as accepting your fallibility as a human being. Research suggests that humility can help you forgive your shortcomings and, as such, create less of a need for defensiveness. And finally, think deeply about what it means to be a good person. Often I see people defend themselves against accusations of racism, homophobia by saying, I can't be racist, I'm a good person. The problem is those 2 things are only opposites if we define good person as someone who never makes mistakes or someone who's immune to social conditioning. Wanting to feel like a good person seems to be like baked into the human psyche. So it makes sense to be thoughtful about what it means to be good. So far as I can tell, there's no humanist definition of goodness that includes being perfect. It includes things like being ethical, inspired by compassion, concern for the well-being of all, and striving toward a world of mutual care and concern. To me, a big part of being a good person is not in whether or how many mistakes I make, but how those mistakes are handled. Do I handle them with grace and humility? Do I treat them as an opportunity for growth? Do I make an attempt to inflict any wrongs inflicted on another? To right any wrongs that I might have inflicted, even if it wasn't intentional. I would recommend that you remind yourself of your deepest values. Those are your, quote, good person values. And being reminded of them can help you determine how you want to react in response to criticism. This is a ton of information, like I said at the beginning, and a lot of different suggestions. Even if you pick one that feels right to you and work on it, it can help you become less defensive. And the value of these efforts is widely applicable, not just in activist contexts. So I do hope that you'll give it a try.